Quick tour of some plants that you should know that grow in old fields, disturbed areas, or that are relatively weedy. They are pioneer plants for the most part and will show up pretty quickly after an area is disturbed. The first one is the biggest and baddest one on the list, the giant ragweed. And a major reason you should know this plant is because it produces flowers that are wind pollinated. Here's a picture of the flower there, not real good. There's a little bit better look at the flowers. And they don't attract insects, they just spew pollen into the air. And this is one of the major causes of hay fever during the summer. Ways to recognize giant ragweed are the three-part leaves. Sometimes they have a few extra lobes. I think it's called ragweed because the leaves are kind of limp and they tend to sort of hang off of the stalk like old rags. Another thing to look for is the overall size and appearance of the plant. It tends to be pretty big. You can sort of see here that might be 4 to 6 feet tall in good growing conditions. And these are all different photos that were uploaded by iNaturalist users. Not 100% sure that every single one is giant ragweed, but almost all of them are. And that's the nature of citizen science. This is a good look at what it looks like in sort of a floodplain forest environment where it's a little bit shaded. The leaves tend to be a bit broader. So that's giant ragweed. Another plant that you should know is cutleaf teasel. And you know that from our work in the natural area at Heartland College. And the seed head is pretty unmistakable. When it dries out, it's very stiff and spiky, and it was used as a way to brush wool and align the hairs and pull sticks and seeds out of wool. So it's used for wool carding in Britain. It's a European plant that's introduced to the United States and is a pretty aggressive weed that will spread along roadsides, because when you mow it, the seeds are knocked off onto the deck of a mower, and then they vibrate off and fall into nearby spots that are ideal for this plant to grow. So again, it thrives in disturbed areas, and you can see it all up and down the interstate if you start to look. Our next species is Queen Anne's lace. It's named for the lacy appearance of the flower. It's also called wild carrot. And this species is normally white. There's a few rare color forms that aren't white. But normally it'll look like this, and you'll see large numbers of these plants covering old fields. It tends to be highly abundant where you find it. Pretty good plant for pollinators, but it is an introduced species from Europe, and like a lot of them is a pretty successful invasive species. That's Queen Anne's lace. Next species you ought to know is common milkweed, and this is a native plant. It's grouped with the weeds here because it does spread readily into disturbed areas. It's a good pioneer plant. It's most well known as a host plant for monarch butterflies. There are a lot of other types of milkweeds that are also good host plants for not just monarch butterflies, but a lot of other insects that breed on this and specialize on milkweed as their only plant host. The leaves are kind of big and leathery and broad. The flowers are a cluster that hangs down, and then the seed pods are these kind of spiky looking things. We saw those out in the HCC nature area. And then as the seeds mature, the pods bust open, and these lightweight seeds burst out, and they fly away on the wind and carry start new plants in disturbed areas where this species thrives best. So it's a good example of a wind-dispersed, insect-pollinated species. Next plant is chicory, also known as common chicory sometimes. This you may have heard of it because chicory root can be dried and ground up and used as a coffee substitute. It's another introduced species from Europe. It's typically a beautiful purplish to sky blue color. But as you'll see here, there are different color forms. Some are more purple, some are more blue, some are white, and some very unusual looking chicories get put on iNaturalist because people notice them. Place where you typically see a lot of chicory is along a roadside, for example, where there's some disturbed ground, and you'll see masses of them. So they'll grow in big groups like this one, and flower in late summer and early fall. Good plant for pollinators, but another introduced and relatively invasive species. Native species is New England Aster. It looks a little bit like chicory, but you'll notice that the flowers have more of a daisy appearance. They have a central area and then the petals coming around the outside. New England Aster is one of many, many species of aster. Most of them have white petals and yellow centers, but some of them are blue or purple. And very highly favored by pollinators such as this bumblebee, and an abundant flowering plant that lasts well into the fall. Sometimes you can even see them after the first frost. Another late summer and early fall blooming species is the black-eyed Susan. It's pretty obvious where the name comes from, the black center and those yellow flowers. It's the same family of plants as the asters, so it has that same daisy look to it. Highly variable. These are black-eyed Susans from all over the world, all over the country. So some of them have different look to their petals, but they all follow the same general theme. It's a very easy to grow plant. It's a great plant if you want to start a prairie in your yard, but it will grow like a weed. It'll be very abundant very quickly, and might overwhelm some of your other native plants. So this is a native species of wildflower that's found in disturbed areas and parts of prairies that have recently been burned or grazed. Will quickly fill in with these for the first couple of years. It's a perennial plant, or is it biennial? I'm not 100% sure. It may die after a couple of years, but it self-seeds and replaces itself very quickly in, say, a prairie that you might have in your yard or neighborhood park. The next species is Canada Goldenrod. It's oops, that's not the best picture. Let's go to the photos. Canada Goldenrod. Sorry about that. It's a sorry about that. This is Canada Goldenrod. It's sometimes also just called goldenrod or common goldenrod, something like that. Giant goldenrod is maybe a close relative. Something you should know is that there are a lot of different kinds of goldenrod. Some of these may not even be Canada goldenrod, and you really need to be an expert, and even they sometimes can't tell them apart. But if you see a big field full of these large goldenrods, chances are good that it's Canada goldenrod. They'll look like this. They'll be often around the edges of disturbed areas. They'll fill old fields and will start blooming in September, and they'll continue to bloom all the way into the first part of November sometimes. Very important source of nectar for insects in the late summer and early fall. And as I've noted, some of these scrawny looking ones may not be Canada goldenrods, but the ones that you see all around the HCC Prairie and in other areas on our field trips will by and large be Canada goldenrod. It's a native plant. It's highly weedy. It's a really good plant for pollinators. It's sort of the buffet for pollinators during the time of the year when there's not very many other flowers. And it's often blamed for causing allergies, but that's just because it's easy to see. It's blooming at the same time as ragweed, and so it gets the blame for the hay fever that's actually caused by ragweed and other wind-pollinated plants. So that's goldenrod, and I wouldn't worry about species unless you're doing an iNat observation or trying to figure it out. I would just call it a goldenrod if I was out in the field. That brings up a quick thing that I wanted to point out, which is that you can do a better job with species identifications if you look at the suggestion. You actually go and visit the page for that species and look at the bottom of the page. It'll say other species commonly misidentified as this one in the United States, and then you can see, oh, well, there are some different types of goldenrod that look a bit like Canada goldenrod, but they're different and they have their own characteristics. So if you are working in iNaturalist trying to pin down an ID for something, look at those species pages and try to figure it out that way. Another thing that I'll point out before I finish up is that you'll be able to challenge yourself to identify these species with a quiz. And I'll just show you real briefly how the gameplay works in that quiz. No, I won't, but I'll send you an email about that later, and you'll be able to compete and practice identifying these species, and you'll get bonus credit for participating, and those that have high scores because we're accurate and quick will get even more credit. And so I hope this helps you learn some plants and get more out of our field trips. Thank you.